إن الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا من يهديه الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله اللهم صل وسلم وبارك عليه وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. Inshallah ta'ala, the talk will be inshallah finished before 9 o'clock inshallah, so that dinner will be served. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bless our gatherings and make it sincerely for the sake of Allah. And may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala guide us to be upon the haqq, the truth, and to accept the truth that a person is upon. The subject, as you heard, it's a verse that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala revealed to the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam in Surah Muhammad. That the verse says, أَفَمَنْ كَانَ عَلَى بَيِّنَةٍ مِّن رَبِّهِ كَمَنْ زُيِّنَ لَهُ سُوءُ عَمَلِهِ وَاتَّبَعُوا أَهْوَاءَهُم, which is a question, istifham, that has inkar or condemning those who are not upon bayyina, clear evidence from the Lord. أَفَمَنْ كَانَ عَلَى بَيِّنَةٍ مِّن رَبِّهِ is the one that is upon bayyina, upon clear proofs and evidences. من ربه, from his Lord, from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. كَمَنْ زُيِّنَ لَهُ سُوءُ عَمَلِهِ وَاتَّبَعُوا أَهْوَاءَهُم, is he the like of someone that سُوءُ عَمَلِهِ, the evil of his actions, زُيِّن, that means it has been adorned for him. His evil actions has been adorned, beautified for him. وَاتَّبَعُوا أَهْوَاءَهُم, and they followed their desires. So as you see clearly in the verse, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala condemning those who they do evil actions and they think it's a good deed because it's been adorned for them, which is a punishment from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. For someone to see his evil actions as beautiful actions. One thing is that a person, if he's doing evil, he sees it as evil. This is one level. And this person is closer to the haqq if he repents to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala than someone that is in a worse state. When someone do evil and he thinks that this is such a beautiful action and this is even something that can get him closer to Allah or whatever. كَمَنْ زُيِّنَ لَهُ, and you see the zuyyin is in the passive tense, that means it's been something that a person is done against. It's a punishment from Allah. And followed their desires. Because at-tawfiq, to be guided, and this is, by the way, not just words of admonition, but this is the definition of the people of Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah. Because the people of philosophy and ilm al-kalam, they have different definitions to it. What is at-tawfiq? What is to be guided to be upon the truth? أَلَّا يَكِلَكَ اللَّهُ إِلَى نَفْسِكَ, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala doesn't make you rely upon yourself, but rather He would help you. That He would give you the i'ana, the help, to be upon the haqq and the truth. And the opposite of the tawfiq, or to be guided, is al-khudlan, when a person is let down, is the opposite in the meaning, which is when a person is led to rely upon himself. And yakilaka Allahu ila nafsik, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would leave the person without helping him to rely upon his own self. And when a person rely upon himself, he thinks that himself is basically seeing what is right, and that's why he's relying upon it. He relies upon what he sees is the source of strength and goodness and righteousness and everything. And since the matter is all by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the believers, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says about them that they are ala bayyinati min rabbi. He is upon clear proofs and evidences from his Lord, from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, not from his own self, not from his own opinions and liking and taste of things, but rather upon the clear evidence and the proofs from his Lord. Which, as all the topics that we talk about, if we are firm upon the foundations of the deen of Islam, everything would fall in place. Because no doubt that we're living at times of fitan. And there are aspects of the deen that are very clear, something that is consensus among the ummah of the Prophet ﷺ. Those who are upon the haqq, the truth, they have bayyina, clear matters and proofs upon it, which is very clear. And some things people might have ignorance about, or they deviated from it, even though it's already been established. So it's not something new, something that has been established from the time of the Prophet ﷺ. No doubt about it whatsoever. And there is the third categories of things, if it's correct to say, these type of nawazil, or new events or crises that occurred to the Muslim ummah, that many people are confused about how to deal with it, how to go about when it comes to these new matters. And people would have all kinds of different opinions and sayings and things like this. If we follow the foundations and the principles in the deen of Islam, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one that guides. So first of all, as the ayah says, أَفَمَنْ كَانَ عَلَى بَيِّنَةٍ مِّن رَبِّهِ, which is the ones that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala praises here, this is the believers. Those who have clear evidences and proofs from the Lord. So the very basic principle that we all should be upon, that we are ummah that follows the wahy from Allah. The wahy from Allah, al-wahy ma'soom, the wahy is protected from any faults. So this is the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam. So this is a very basic principle in our deen. So anything that is clearly stated in the Quran and in the Sunnah of the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam, this is what we follow. And the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam, which is the third category of matters, or even the second one, or in any matter, when he informed us alayhi salatu wasalam, and we talked about this hadith many times before, that there will be changes and deviations among the ummah, the Prophet ﷺ clearly stated the ways, which is the principle for the Muslim to follow, that never changes whatsoever, which is تَرَكْتُكُمْ عَلَى الْبَيْضَاءِ, I left you on the bayda, which is the white matter, meaning the clear matter. In some of the narrations, al-mahajja, which is not always in all of the narrations, which is al-tariq, the path that is clear. There's no darknesses in it, there's no confusion in it, there's no ambiguity in it. Layluha kanahari, and the Prophet ﷺ explained it with more clear bayyina, with clear characteristics of it, so that nobody will have doubt in it. Layluha kanahari, the night of it is like the day. So that means there's no darkness. A person can see in front of him different than when a person is during the night versus during the day. That means the path is very clear. لا يزيغ عنها إلا هالك. The only ones that would deviate away from it are the destroyed ones, the perished ones. And he said عليه الصلاة والسلام, and this is in the famous hadith of Al-Irbad ibn Sariyah radiallahu anhu, in it the Prophet عليه الصلاة والسلام, he said فإنه من يعش منكم فسيرى اختلافا كثيرا, whoever lives among you, he will see many different things. So فعليكم بسنتي وسنة الخلفاء الراشدين المهديين من بعدي عضوا عليها بالنواجذ وإياكم محدثات الأمور, the hadith, which means whoever lives among you will find many different things. Therefore be upon my sunnah, my way, and the sunnah of the Khulafa al-Rashidin al-Mahdiyin min ba'di, and the sunnah of the rightly guided Khalifa after me, Abu Bakr, Umar, Uthman, and Ali radiallahu anhu. Addu alayha bin nawajid, bite on it with your teeth, and be warned against the newly introduced matters in the deen, the bid'ah in the deen, as the hadith mentioned. فَإِنَّ كُلَّ بِدْعَةٍ ضَلَالَةٍ, because every bid'ah is deviation. And we talked about this before, and this is something that should be well established as a principle in our hearts. And the other principle, which is before all of them, is that we are created to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala alone. وَمَا خَلَقْتُ الْجِنَّ وَالْإِنسَ إِلَّا لِيَعْبُدُونَ. And for us to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we have to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala ala basira, ala bayyina, on clear evidences and proofs. Is not left to our own desires, but we have to follow. قل هذه سبيلي أدعو إلى الله على بصيرة أنا ومن اتبعني, as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala commanded the Prophet عليه الصلاة والسلام to be upon. This is my way. أدعو إلى الله. I call you to Allah. I call people to Allah alone, not to groups, not to oneself, but to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala على بصيرة, on clear vision and proofs and evidences. Matter are very clear. أنا ومن اتبعني, meaning myself and also those who followed me. So those who follow the Prophet ﷺ, also they're commanded to call to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala ala basir. And that's why, as mentioned the quote before, وَلَا يَكُونُ الْعَبْدُ مِنْ أَتْبَاعِ النَّبِيِّ صَلَّى اللَّهُ عَلَيْهِ وسلم حَقًّا حتى يدعو إلى ما دعا إليه النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم على بصيرة. So the person would never be a true follower of the Prophet عليه الصلاة والسلام till he called to Allah the same way the Prophet عليه الصلاة والسلام called على بصيرة, on clear evidences and proof. And the way the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, because of the time, yes, we need to have some details, inshallah ta'ala, with the ayat and the hadith, and this is a daily effort that we need to put, that the way of the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, that is incumbent upon every Muslim to follow, as we heard in the hadith, the way the Sahaba radiallahu anhum, the early generations of Islam, the four Imams, Imam Abi Hanifa, Imam Malik, Imam al-Shafi'i, Imam Ahmad, the Imam of the Deen, Imam al-Awza'i, Sufyan al-Thawri, Sufyan ibn Uyayna, all of these great Imam of the Tabi'een, the Sahaba and the Tabi'een, to follow them, to follow the understanding of the Deen of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala before things, deviations and changed and so on, not from our own liking or understanding, but from the nusus, from the wahy, the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam. When we see this, we would see that the purpose of our life is what? Is to fulfill the ubudiyyah to Allah, to be ibad to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that's why, as a principle, as a quote, that حاجة الناس إلى الهدى أعظم من حاجتهم إلى الرزق والنصر. The need that people should have to guidance is far more than their need to be provided for and to be victorious and well established. And look at the affairs of human beings in general. What is their priority? It is not to undermine anything, but what is the purpose that we're created for? What is the meaning of being successful in this life? If a person born and lived and died at a time when the ummah in large, a person would say that they're humiliated, oppressed, weak, and so on. Does that make this entire ummah and every single individual in it in loss and they are doomed forever? The answer is no, for sure, definitely. If they are guided, if they are steadfast upon the deen of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, they are victorious in this life and in the hereafter by holding fast to the deen of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So unless we agree, because we have to have common grounds in whatever subject that we talk about. So what is the most important need in our life? Al-Hidayah. To be guided, to be upon the truth. So if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sees in the hearts of the believers this zeal, that this is the most important thing to them. Not to please anyone, not to please themselves, not to please their spouses, their children, not to please their neighbors, not to please the entire world. Their zeal, their concern is to please Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala alone. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sees what's in our hearts. If a person is sincere in this, and then he goes about with the proper al-asalib al-shar'iyya, the proper religious matters, by following the wahy from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one that guides. So al-hidayah, ihdina as-sirat al-mustaqim, guide us to the straight path. Many, many times we say every day. And that's why every single human being, they have this ghariza, this jibillah. And again, lectures, when it's not stories and things like that, it's easy to lose everyone. So hopefully, inshallah ta'ala, you guys are paying attention. So we have our nature as human beings. There are certain things that we are born with. Like it's default in every single human being. One of which is, everybody's a sinner. Except after the Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he's the ma'soom. Human beings are what? They're weak, they're deficient, they're sinners, right? Ignorant, all these types of things. And we need to work on ourselves to be constantly repenting to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So one of the things that we have in our ghariza, in our jibillah, in our natural way that we're created with, is that when it comes to the guidance, certain things we are guided to do. We have been guided, born with some guidance. الذي أعطى كل شيء خلقه ثم هدى. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said in Surah Taha, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one that gave كل شيء خلقه. Everything He gave, that He created, then He guided it. He guided the animals to do whatever they're created for. They don't have to be taught. The cow doesn't have to be taught to be a cow. And the goat doesn't have to be taught to be a goat. And the lion doesn't have to be taught to be a lion. Each one having their jibillah, right? This is the way that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created them. And the human beings, they have this jibillah in them, which is basically the worldly matters, but also it governed by the wahy revelation from Allah. So therefore we have a ghariza, we have the natural way in ourselves, and we have aql, we have reason, which is either to be on one side and a person benefits from it, or it becomes against the person if a person turns away from the wahy from Allah and he rely upon his own jibillah, or upon his own way of thinking, which is oftentimes is contaminated with many things, the environment that the person is in, ignorance, what he receives from what he hears, what he sees, which is all forms of corruptions and diseases to the hearts. So this is guidance that is by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And there is the guidance of al-bayan wal-irshad for people to get to know. And this is the bayina, right? This is the bayina, to be able to see the haqq from the batil, the truth from falsehood. إِنَّا هَدَيْنَاهُ السَّبِيلَ إِمَّا شَاكِرًا وَإِمَّا كَفُورًا. We guided him to be either a grateful slave to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala or an ungrateful one. And this is the messengers, the books from Allah, and this is the wahy from Allah. And the final message is the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. And as mentioned before many times, it's all wahy from Allah, revelation from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, both the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. And the more there are times of fitan and tribulations and unclarity and things like this, the more it's an obligation upon every individual to make sure that they know the wahy al-ma'soom, this protected wahy from Allah. Different than if you're living at times when the people are upon righteousness and goodness and everything is clear. If you have a matter, you go to the alim, to the sheikh, he gives you the answer and the matter is easy. But when the more there is deviation, the more there is deception and things like this, the more the person has to make sure that he is upon what is right, and he has to take the means, which is also clearly stated in the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. The people of Ahl Sunnah, they're very clear in these matters, and that's why they always initiate and do things based on the nusus, based on the text, based on the wahy from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this is the bayina, this is the clear evidences and proofs. Versus those who would use their reason, and the reason takes over and they can alter and twist things in the revelation from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So when we talk about the bayina and the evidences and the proofs and these foundations, when we talk about it and how to hold fast to it, what is the most important thing in our life? We can list them and we learn them all the time. Matters of the tawheed, the aqidah, the proper belief that a person should be upon. That is in the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, the way the Sahaba radiallahu anhum and the Tabi'een they were upon. The obligations, the halal and the haram, that also is been established in the wahy from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And there are more principles that we need to be upon, especially when things are not clear. One important principle in the worldly life that we live in, with means of change, when people are weak and oppressed and they want to change their state, their status, and they want to be upon goodness, which is something that is agreed upon. Everybody wants to be like this. In the deen of Allah, the objective we have and the means to it also we have in the deen of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So also the means are part of the deen. So the Prophet ﷺ, at one stage of his da'wah, his life ﷺ, as a messenger, when the wahy was revealed to the Prophet ﷺ, physically, for those who see it, he was in Mecca before the Hijrah, weak and oppressed. The Sahaba radiallahu anhum were tortured, and there is wahy that is revealed to the Prophet ﷺ, requires for the ulama, and this is a huge subject, not motivational speakers, not people that just read some things and they lead people, no, the people of ilm. So we have, this is in the wahy, how the Prophet ﷺ dealt with this part of the da'wah in his life, how the Prophet ﷺ did not even make hijrah till Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala commanded him to make hijrah. He does not do anything from his own desire ﷺ. And when he migrated to Al-Madinah, dealing with all aspects of things, it's all wahy from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then things has been established in the deen of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. One of these clear principles, because of the time, is, and this is something very clear, and it should be clear that we understand it so that we don't argue in matters that has no place for it, or foundation for it, or grounds for it. That, as mentioned before, sins, disobeying Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, is never a mean and a way to attain anything of goodness whatsoever. And this should be something that is agreed upon. And to know the ma'siyah, to know the sin or what's against the deen of Allah, it's also from the wahy from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So there's a huge principle in the deen of Islam that al-wasa'il laha ahkam al-ghayat, also that the means have the same ahkam and rulings as the objectives. So if your objective, the goal has to be noble. If someone, his objective, his goal is to spread corruption on the face of earth, this is an obvious one. Even if he takes means that looks like being righteous, like Iblis, right? The objective has to be righteous according to the wahy from Allah. So if the objective is noble, is something that is a good cause, something that would establish the deen of Allah based on these principles, guidance on the deen of Allah to establish the purpose of our life, the mean to it has to be also noble and righteous and according to the deen of Allah. The end justify the means. This is not in the deen of Islam. This is not the way that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants from us. This is a principle. This is a foundation that never should be ever changed. So as a result of that, and I mentioned this example before, but I would give you a test. As an individual, we're not trying to solve the problems of the ummah. If you as an individual, you've been offered a job, and the job is halal, and the money of it is purely halal, and mashallah, perfect. You make your salah on time, and all the rights will be observed, the rights of your family, your parents, everything, mashallah. 100% halal. But with the condition that they would ask you to commit one small sin. This is part of the contract. Just one sin, and then after that, you'll get the job, and everything will be halal for the rest of your life. I'm not talking about you falling into a sin. We're all sinners. We all fall into sins. I'm talking about this is a deal here. And you would have a choice. Is it permissible for you to say and to agree, yes, I'll take one glass of wine. Wal'iyadhu billah. Someone would say that, someone else. That he would take a glass of wine, and in return he would get this great job that he has money to give charity. The money itself is going to be halal, and he will give charity and benefit the ummah from it. Is it permissible for him to do so? Does anybody says yes? You would find some people sometimes would say, I'll just commit that sin and then repent to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then everything is, mashallah, is beautiful. Is it permissible to make that decision? The answer is no. So that means what? This is a principle in our deen. It is not permissible to commit a sin, even if it's something, doesn't have to be a glass of wine. It can be what you consider as a small sin. And there's no small and major when it comes to this obeying Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. There's no such a thing as a rule in the deen of Islam. To attain a maslaha, to attain a benefit, that it can be through the path of sin. There's no thing whatsoever in the deen of Islam like this. We're not talking about ad-darura. Ad-darura, necessity. A person is dying, and the only way to save his life is to eat the flesh of a pig or swine or so. This is a matter to save one's life. Ad-darurat, this is not what we're talking about. But in the norm is nobody has the right to say that. Why? Because we have bayyinah. We have clear evidences and proofs that if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala forbade something, never to say, but the circumstances, but our life is this, but the pressure that we have as Muslims is this. All of that is what? You used your own opinions, your own likings, not wahy. You would never find in the wahy from Allah ever that it permits you that you disobey Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for some benefit that you would get for the deen. And that's why if we have the time, I'm not sure if we even went through this or not, but Sheikh Ibrahim Zidan rahimahullah, some people once they hear the name, they become irritated. But again, he was asked a question, and I remember mentioning this before. He gave a long answer to a question. I'm not going to go through the long answer, but he was asked عن جماعة, about a group of people. يجتمعون على قصد الكبائر. They get together to commit major sins. People, they get together to disobey Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. من القتل وقطع الطريق والسرقة وشرب الخمر, killing others, robbery, highway robbers, stealing, drinking wine, you name it. وغير ذلك. This is how their life is. ثم إن شيخا من المشايخ المعروفين بالخير واتباع السنة. Then this is the question. One of the shuyukh that is known to be upon khair and goodness, and he follows the sunnah of the Prophet عليه الصلاة والسلام, and this by the way in the مجموع الفتاوى, قصد منع المذكورين, he intended to stop them from these evil actions that they're upon, فلم يمكنه إلا أن يقيم لهم سماعا يجتمعون فيه بهذه النية. The only way that he can get them to listen to him is that he would get them to have سماع. السماع is when they listen to na'at, right? Praising the Prophet ﷺ, things like this, might be with a duf, with musical instruments, with whatever, right? That they would get together with this niyyah. And I'm sorry, this is something that I went further. He says, وَهُوَ بِدُفٍ بِلَا صَلَاسِلٍ وَغِنَاءٍ. Without, it's only with a duf, without rings, without bells, without singing music, musical instruments, بشعر مباح, with permissible poetry, بغير شبابة, without the bad words in it and things like this. فلما فعل هذا, when this individual, this sheikh, he did that, تاب منهم جماعة, group of them, they repented to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. وأصبح من لا يصلي ويسرق ولا يزكي يتورع عن الشبهات ويؤدي المفروضات ويجتنب المحرمات. And group of them, those who repented to Allah, the one that never been making salah, he was not even making salah before, and he would steal and never give zakah. Now he is yatawarra, he has wara' from even ash-shubuhat, the doubtful matters, and he fulfill the obligations and he stay away from the haram. Beautiful results, correct? No doubt. The question is, فهل يباح فعل هذا السماع لهذا الشيخ على هذا الوجه? Is what he's doing is permissible the way that the sama'an together them to make these types of events and activities, because لما يترتب عليه من المصالح, because there's great benefits is happening. We decrease the evil so much on the face of earth with something that people would do anyway, even in their, without any purpose. مع أنه لا يمكنه, and listen to that, even though he does not have any means to give them da'wah except this. This is the only way. And I would ask you sincerely, again, this is, imagine someone nowadays, a question like this is presented to him. How many people would say, sure, save them from these major evil actions that they're upon, and it's okay if they're doing something small. Right? Most people would say this. And this is the misery that we're living in. That means people are not going according to the foundations of the deen. And again, to make it clear, we're not talking about these individuals, we're talking about the sheikh. The question is about the sheikh, right? The question is about the person of knowledge, or to the people, he's someone of righteousness, and he's known to be followers of the sunnah. The question is not about these individuals. If these individuals, they turn away from the evil actions that they're upon to do of a lesser evil, we should feel at least this is good for them. They change closer. But the question here is about the ones that are upon the deen. And that's why when we're coming to the masajid, we're not talking about those who are away from the deen. We're talking about those who are upon the deen. And this is basically what we need to focus upon. Because these types of things can change the deen or can make the person firm upon the deen. If I read for you the answer, we need 2 hours at least. But this is how the way of Sheikh sent me. But why? Because he established the foundation of the deen and the purpose of our life and the way to follow the Prophet ﷺ and all of these types of things and the guidance and all of these types of things. And then at the end, right, hopefully I can get to the end because it's very too long. Basically he says that this is not permissible for that sheikh to do this. Because why? Because either you would follow your reason or you follow the nusus, the wahy. Where is in the wahy from Allah? This is a challenge to the world, right? Where in the wahy from Allah? The Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, that a sheikh, alim so-called, he would approve for the people to commit sins or be with them while they're committing sins so that he would take them to a benefit or something good that they will be upon. You would never find anything like this. Unless a person, there's a gun on his head, that's a different situation, right? So unless we agree that this is a principle in the deen, there's no such a thing as committing a sin to bring a benefit, then we can afterwards see things things can become clearer in some aspects. So this is again a principle in the deen of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that's why when we're living at times when the people do not know their ulama, and basically those who are being followed are those who have maybe more followers, or they speak with nice speech and actions and working on the emotions of the people and things of that nature. But are we following the nusus? Are we following the wahy or not? This is an aspect that is fariqa, meaning that it's, if you're not upon this, then there's no need for us to continue. Unless we honor the wahy from Allah, the revelation from Allah, the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ clearly, by following the people of knowledge, of course, right? Then we can speak. But many matters that people say, or they do, protests and things of that nature, they're already doing it. They did not go back to the ulama and ask them, by the way. People did not say, oh, we're not going to do anything unless we ask the people of knowledge. We want to know what's in the Quran and the Sunnah. I'm talking about Muslims or leaders among the Muslims. And again, this is a debatable issue, right? But sometimes it's waste of time to talk about it in some aspects because they did not even refer to the ulama to ask them, or they want to know what is in the deen of Islam about this first, but rather do it because everybody's doing it and then attack those who say that this is not permissible or permissible. And that's why, so that we avoid the arguments, I'm not talking about this aspect from as far as the ruling is concerned. I think it's an obvious one if we follow these principles. But the matter here is that as Muslims, even after we finish and we'll sit and talk and eat while we're eating, you would find the brothers saying, but what are we going to do in this situation? Are we going to follow the principles or not? One sin, small sin, if you're sincerely going about the deen of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, once you do not follow the deen of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then don't talk about the deen of Allah. Don't make it a deen issue. That means it's between you and yourself and whatever you're doing. The deen of Allah is nusus, is wahy, revelation from Allah. Qala Allah, qala Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. And there's no such a thing as committing sins as a result of that. One important aspect also as a result of this, because we always have to refer to this back. And don't say or belittle it. We have a thing in Arabic, I'm not sure if it's in English. You know that statement, لا صوت يعلو فوق صوت المعركة. I'm not sure how they translate it, but if there's a ma'raka, if there's a battle, they say no sound is louder than the sound of the battle. If people are fighting, and you come and tell them while they're fighting and things like this, you need to raise your garment, brother, because this is not permissible. He's going to tell you what, leave me alone, I'm in the battlefield. Something like this. Nothing is more important than what they're engaged in, right? This is also, there has to be wahy from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But again, the priorities in our life, this is not what we go about. We go about to make the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala superior, to be guided upon the deen of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to follow the deen of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and not necessarily what the people do with good intentions. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reward people with their intentions and to invite on others and so on. And we're not talking about the masses, we're talking about those who at least, they want to be upon matters of the deen, and that's why it's important upon us with the third category when it comes to know the ulama of the deen of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this is once the subject is mentioned. If we just give that question, who are the ulama of the ummah? Do you see how miserable the matter is? You see how big fitna that we have? Just to answer, can you answer this question? You don't have to answer. Who are the ulama of this ummah? The enemies of Allah, they worked very diligently to detach the people from their ulama. So now the ulama are accused of this and accused of that, and they don't know anything. Either they don't know anything because they don't really know the reality of the people. They just ask them about their salah and their zakah and that's it. Or they sell out and this and that, ulama. So the fact that some people, this matter is not clear to them, this is a miserable thing. This is something that a person need to flee to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to get this one clear. فَمَنْ كَانَ عَلَى بَيِّنَةٍ مِّن رَبِّهِ. Because it's part of our deen, which is the third category of things of how to make things clear, as mentioned earlier, is to know the people of knowledge. فَاسْأَلُوا أَهْلَ الذِّكْرِ إِن كُنْتُمْ لَا تَعْلَمُونَ. As the people of knowledge, if you do not know. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned that also clearly in the Quran. وَإِذَا جَاءَهُمْ أَمْرٌ مِّنَ الْأَمْنِ أَوْ الْخَوْفِ أَذَاعُوا بِهِ وَلَوْ رَدُّوهُ إِلَى الرَّسُولِ وَإِلَى أُولِي الْأَمْرِ مِنْهُمْ لَعَلِمَهُ الَّذِينَ يَسْتَنبِطُونَهُ مِنْهُمْ. Which means that whenever a matter of security or fear comes to them, they would spread it and they would make it widespread. This is the ways of the hypocrites or the ignorant ones. And if they return it back, refer it back to Allah and His Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and those who يستنبطونه منهم, the people of knowledge, those who would follow the Prophet عليه الصلاة والسلام and they've learned this deen, then they would, and أولي الأمر منهم, أولي الأمر are the umara and the ulama, the leaders, the authorities, and the ulama, the people of knowledge. So the people of knowledge is incumbent upon a Muslim to know the people of knowledge. And the people of knowledge, those who learn the deen of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, this is lineage, by the way. And that's why the all of a sudden alim, all of a sudden, surprise, there's a alim that came all of a sudden. No, this is lineage, where the lineage comes from. And this is a detailed subject, because it doesn't mean necessarily that a person has been going through that lineage, because لا يزال الناس بخير, as Salman al-Farisi radiallahu anhu, he said, people will continue to be upon goodness ما أخذ آخرهم عن أولهم, as long as the last takes from the first. It's a continuous chain. And if they don't, halaku, they will be perished. So it's a lineage. The ulama, they learn, and they spend the time to learn the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam. And as a result of that, also their work of ilm is to be widespread and to refer to the ulama. And this is the way that a person save himself. And who are the ulama? Those who follow the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ and follow these principles. They follow these principles. They follow the understanding of the early generations of Islam. Their fatwa, their actions is all upon this. They're not upon invented aqidah, a matter of belief that is invented hundreds of years after the Prophet ﷺ. No, they are upon the aqidah of the people of Ahlul Sunnah wal Jama'ah. They call people to be upon the Tawheed. They warn against the Shirk. They state what's haram and what's halal, and they call people to the obedience of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And if a person is not a alim, he has, or his ulama are known, and he refers to the ulama. He does not refer to himself as the leader of the ummah, but rather he would say about his ulama, who are his lineage, where does he come from? And this is something that becomes clearer, and that's why ending with this is like, as Shatibi and others, they say, especially at times when things are not very clear, everyone has to have some form of ijtihad and effort. This is the reality that we have to face. If it's the alim, his area of ijtihad is what? An-nusus, the text, the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. If he's a alim, if he's not an alim, he follows. The common Muslim, he has to have an ijtihad. His ijtihad is to get to know the ulama. This is an effort that has to be done. And again, the ulama are those who, the followers of the Prophet ﷺ, and they are upon that lineage with the proper understanding of the deen of Allah. They support the understanding of the early generations of Islam. They don't get irritated by saying we follow as-salafus salih. How beautiful that statement it is. Someone, because even if others they contaminated, it doesn't matter. If someone gives a bad image to the deen of Islam, does that make you hide your identity as a Muslim? وَمَنْ أَحْسَنُ قَوْلًا مِمَّنْ دَعَا إِلَى اللَّهِ وَعَمِلَ صَالِحًا وَقَالَ إِنَّنِي مِنَ الْمُسْلِمِينَ. Yes, this is enough word to bring us all together. But to be upon the deen of Islam that was present at the time of the Prophet ﷺ and the early generations of Islam, without a group, without allegiance, without all of these things, is just to be upon the truth and to seek help from Allah, to seek guidance from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to be steadfast upon the deen of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And again, if doubts come in some of these issues, remember, there's no such a thing as a small sin. And this is just one aspect of it, because some oftentimes it get overlooked. Okay, let's go to the next doubtful matter. If you make ta'zeem of the command of Allah, if you exalt the commands of Allah because you're a Muslim and you want to be upon righteousness, then a sin is never a mean to bring a benefit. And the Prophet ﷺ, when he saw Abdullah ibn Umar radiallahu anhu with his izar was dragging, and he asked him, Ben, and who are you? He says, Ana Abdullah. He says, I'm Abdullah. He said, Irfa, law kunta Abdullah, farfa izarak. If you are the Abd of Allah, raise your garment. Mentioned this today in the khutbah, and I was like, and I would ask everybody the same question. People might say that afterwards is, Look at these people. Turning away from what the ummah is facing and saying to the people, raise your garment. If you understand it this way, with all due respect, either you have an agenda or you're not you don't think in the proper way. Right? Meaning what? Being abdu to Allah, be slave of Allah in all aspects of our life. You're going to have to eat and drink and wear clothing and things like this. Why is it that we have to justify small sins because we're busy about major things? Aren't you going to eat something today? If someone eating something haram, someone says, brother, it's okay. The ummah is facing major issues here. Is that a valid thing? Or even in recommended acts. If you're walking in the street and you see something that might be harmful to the people on the road, isn't it a shu'bah from al-iman? It's part of al-iman is what? Imatatul adha an al-tariq, right? To remove an obstacle from the road of the people. You don't have to wait for the police unless it's dangerous. I'm not calling for people to put their lives in harm's way. But if you have something harmful for the people in the sidewalk, right, and you remove it so that people don't get harmed, don't get najasa on them or whatever there is, this is a good deed or not? And this is in the hadith, al-iman bid'un wa sab'un, and in a riwayah bid'un wa sittun. 70 thumbs, something, or 60 thumbs, something, shu'bah, parts. أعلاها قول لا إله إلا الله. The highest level part of al-iman is la ilaha illallah. And the lowest of it is imatatul adha an al-tariq, to remove an obstacle from the road. وَالْحَيَاءُ شُعْبَةٌ مِنَ الْإِيمَانِ, and haya, modesty, shyness is part of al-iman. So if someone walking on the sidewalk and he sees something that is obstacle for the people and he wants to remove it, and that brother that always get that argument, and he would say, what? Brother, the ummah is facing difficult times. What are you doing? This is a minor thing. Leave it now. Does that make sense? He can remove it and still have the concern to the ummah. There's no contradictions here. So the point here is to be obedient to Allah. And this is basically what our affairs is upon, because we turned away from the commands of Allah. And this is the way of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that is clearly stated in the Quran and in the Sunnah of the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam. And therefore is to be obedient to Allah, never to commit a sin thinking that this will bring any benefits to us as individuals or the ummah of the Prophet ﷺ, because sin's what made us be in that state that we're in, and with goodness, with gentleness, with the concern towards others, with leniency, with making all the means and making dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for our goodness and the goodness of the Muslim ummah, and to bring the matters and the hearts together to be upon the rope of Allah and the deen of Islam and the sunnah of the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam. صلى الله وسلم وبارك على محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. سبحانك اللهم ربنا وبحمدك أشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت أستغفرك وأتوب إليك. No questions, inshallah, unless when we sit and eat, then I'm going to refer you back to the differences. You have something? Oh, the food is upstairs. So the food is upstairs, inshallah. So please proceed, inshallah. And again, you can ask anytime, inshallah. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make us all upon what is right, inshallah. Jazakumullah khair.